Generally speaking, in the grand scheme of things, there are lots of different ways that people can judge music, a lot of different criteria that they can hold it to. And while I don't necessarily think that any one way is more correct, or better, or worse than others, these methods generally boil down to one of two groups. On the one hand, a group who judges music more as a science, who might look at the intricacy of an arrangement, the complexity of a rhythm section, or how mature they feel that the melody is. And on the other hand, there's a group who largely judges music by the emotional responses it evokes in the listener, or possibly the emotional intent of the artist and how those interact. And personally, I fall somewhere in the middle. I feel like with music, you can't have one without the other. There needs to be some sort of instrumental proficiency for any emotion to be communicated, but there also has to be some emotion to communicate for instrumental proficiency to mean anything. And with that being understood, I feel like music is something that can be empirically studied and to some extent valued, but I also strongly disagree with the methods that more traditional music reviewers take and how factually they try to analyze something that is inherently very subjective. But I also make these videos, I also do enjoy analyzing, to some extent picking apart music, and I have my own criteria that I do that by. And for a while I've been using them to make a series about the albums which I feel are Green Day's best, explaining by my criteria why I think so. But today I'd like to take a step back from that and talk about one of the albums which are one of my favorites from Green Day. I think it's important to talk about the positives and negatives of things, even things that we love. And I think an interesting side effect from this is that, at least personally, I find that a lot of the things we love about something has to do with embracing its flaws. And finding that irrational love, that isn't really that irrational anyway, because music isn't about logic. So today we're talking about one of my favorite albums, Kerplunk by Green Day.
Just this one. This one's about your mama. This sounds going
Kerplunk was effectively the first album by the Green Day that we know today, the Green Day of Billy Joe Armstrong, Mike Dirnt, and Trey Cool. I feel that Kerplunk is a very unique album and is essentially one of a kind. Coming out in 1991, there were definitely not a lot of pop-punk bands, at least not the type of pop-punk that the genre name would come to be associated with in the following decade. Sure, there were really old pop-punk bands, most notably the Ramones, and as the decades went on, there were more proto-punk bands that kind of flirted with a punk sound that most people don't consider true punk, bands like the Kinks and sometimes like the Buzzcocks. But generally speaking, in the late 80s and very early 90s, most of the bands that we now see as pop punk pretty much only existed in the Bay Area in California. And out of those, unless you have an ear for nowadays pretty obscure music, the only really big lasting name from that movement as it originally existed was Green Day. And coming to this point, at this point in time, in the early 90s, we need to establish what exactly we mean by pop punk, because it's a word that can mean an awful lot and refer to an awful lot of very different bands. Throughout the 80s, it wasn't uncommon at all for punk bands to have really strong melodies and interesting and catchy hooks. So for the sake of today here, we'll define that the defining characteristic of pop punk is that it focuses on a catchy melody, that the catchy melody is the focal point and center of the song, falling very much in line with the pop rock that inspired it from the 60s and 70s. Songs like Another State of Mind or Holiday in Cambodia arguably have very catchy melodies, but at least going off of how I interpret them, it's the punkier elements of those songs that really draw you to it and that are ultimately the focal points of the songs. Now, Green Day's debut album, 39 Smooth, definitely embodies this idea, but it does so sort of hesitantly. It's an album filled with catchy melodies, but also trying desperately to counterbalance that with more traditional guitar solos. And this, of course, is also affected by the original drummer, John, who had a much more traditional punk take on the drums, ignoring the obviously very important political roots of the genre of punk. The sonics and instrumentals of the genre had a very strong influence as being the opposition of what was happening in rock and roll at the time. The songs getting longer and more gratuitous, with the instrumentalists, who were arguably very good, kind of just showing off. Punk kept it stripped down, just 1 or 2 minutes long, and as the song's arrangements got more and more complex and more instruments and components were added, punk kept it stripped down, with 1 or 2 guitarists, a bassist, and a percussionist. Sonically, punk manifests its rebel spirit, its unwillingness to conform, and a determination to carve its own path by throwing away what would be traditionally considered ways to make quality music, methods of composition and that kind of thing, and in embracing a more sort of pure noise and incredibly direct emotional channel, punk really forged its new identity as minimalist, DIY, and very, very passionate. And with all this considered, it's no wonder that as Green Day was coming into themselves in the late 80s and early 90s, they were met with some resistance. It seemed to go against the very core tenets of punk, its very essence, to embrace a more melodic structure, to bring back some of those elements that had been abandoned from classic rock, classic pop rock. Again, importantly, Green Day were not the first band to explore this territory or to try to carve this new sound. But, in my opinion, on this album, Kerplunk, Green Day were the first band to triumphantly, totally be successful in embodying a new sound like this. And because of the things that it does and because of how it does them, Kerplunk is, in many ways, to me, the beginning of a new genre, is kind of a genre unto itself. Kerplunk opens with 2,000 Light Years Away and One for the Razorbacks, a pair of songs that do essentially the same thing but approach them from slightly different angles. And together they really serve as the mission statement for Kerplunk and for Green Day's identity at this time. And from the opening track, it's immediately obvious that Kerplunk has a very strong duality going on, that its rhythm section and melody section, while influencing each other and vibing together as they definitely should, also have a very strong, not break, but individuality between them. And this duality is heavily informed by Armstrong's approach to his guitar work on this album. Contrasting the previous album where he took a more straightforward punk edge filled with guitar solos and really trying to be impressive and somewhat in your face, here the guitar work absolutely melds to the background. It's incredibly hazy mastering, blending it in with the general mess and noise of the track's mastering. It's not total noise. The notes are still very distinct and you can tell what's going on with the guitar work, but it has the effect of creating a very fuzzy, echoey, and oftentimes distant vibe to the guitar in general. And this approach to the sonics of the guitar meshes perfectly with the incredibly melodic focus of the melody section in general, how it shifts a lot of the weight, power, and importance of the melody to vocal delivery. This is the factor that makes Kerplunk a pop-punk album in the modern sense, and it's doing this factor well, the way that this album treats this approach, that makes it a very good pop-punk album. With the guitar work just that little bit held back, and with it mastered in a way that the edges of the sonics of the guitar blend with the edges of the sonics of the vocals, it creates an effect as if it feels like the vocals are in the foreground of the track, as if they get priority in the mastering, when importantly they actually don't. The sonics, especially in these opening songs, are very well balanced between the instrumental components and the vocals, maintaining a hazy and more messy aesthetic and allowing it to not become overly poppy or feel polished. This might be best illustrated in the pre-chorus, build-up, and chorus in 2,000 Light Years Away. The guitar does a very basic power chordish thing, but the vocals, especially with a little bit of harmony, definitely embody the melody of the song. They complement each other amazingly, and the guitar acts more of just a little accent to the melody. Really, though, this approach to melody could be good or bad, and it all depends on how the rhythm section responds to it. And as the next song, Run for the Razorbacks, begins, we get to see fully how they approach this. The song opens with a very subdued little accent by the guitar, allowing the focus to entirely shift to the bass line. And there's nothing to say about this era of Mike Dirnt's bass work that hasn't been said before. It's just great. He makes it seem effortless with how he creates these simple but creative and fun little bass lines. And then it's a signature drum line from Trey that really takes over the momentum of the song. And even though strictly sonically speaking, it's actually Billy's guitar line snapping into the auditory forefront that gets the song rolling, it's really spiritually and, in effect, Trey's drum work that gets it there. Importantly, the rhythm section in general is very lively, creative, energetic, and even, weirdly, a little funky. The rhythm section really does generally play a more traditional and therefore subdued role, but because of how the guitar line and melody hold back, giving, if not auditory space, then space in the composition, they're allowed to play this traditional role, but also have a lot of fun stretching into the forefront of the song with a lot of little creative things. And even though there's a guitar solo in the song, it still holds back and plays to a more rolling melody, and therefore just allows the song to maintain this wonderful groove to it. With the peppy and consistent melody and the absolutely fun and often creative rhythm section, I think it's best to describe the sound in general on Kerplunk as incredibly smooth. And the lyrics in these songs do an amazing job of taking advantage of that effortless smoothness and harmony provided by the sound. Together, 2,000 Light Years Away and One for the Razorbacks are two of the most absolutely wholesome pop-punk songs out there. A song about missing someone you love who's far away, and a song about being there for someone you love. The album really takes the opportunity to take advantage of the vibe created by by these simpler songs to tell a simpler but nonetheless very enjoyable little story at the opening. It's an album that's a lot of fun, it's creative, and it still has a punk spirit, but it also goes down really smoothly. It's really easy to listen to. And across the album, it really push and pulls flows between two approaches to the smoothness. The more straight up poppy and energetic approach, the more traditional to pop, which is found on the opening tracks, and then a more, for lack of a better word, not funky, but maybe, I guess, dank approach that's taken on the next song, Welcome to Paradise. Welcome to Paradise totally sonically pulls every element of the song away from the foreground to the midground and background of the track. The lower pitched aspects of the sound get a little bit more focus. The song showcases a very simple but nonetheless very well done evolution and progression throughout. It captures the angsty, subdued, ever-present terror of first leaving home as the song's about. The uncertain lows, especially with the lower pitch, is embodied here in a way that I think it just isn't in the re-recording on Dookie. And I also love the way, and I'm not sure if this will make sense, but the way that Mike sort of humbly shreds on the bass here. That such a creative bass line isn't treated like it's anything special, it's just back there doing what the bass does. Welcome to Paradise generally did a great job of auditorily focusing you to the center of the sound, so that when the next song, Christy Road, starts up, and it immediately lets the guitar line especially bleed more to the outside of the sound, it immediately creates a sharp distinction between the two. Though that being said, part of me kind of feels like we got to this point on the album a little early. Maybe another song or two could have come between Welcome to Paradise and Christy Road, or maybe one or two before Welcome to Paradise in general. There's something just a little bit awkward about the flow of the album here, but it's not a huge deal. And while Christy Road is a song I really like on paper, whose lyrics I really like, I feel that it doesn't quite manifest and come together quite as well as it could. At this point, when this album was recorded, Trey hadn't been a full member for very long, and while the members jive together pretty well prior to the song, I think here it sort of starts catching up how Trey wants to just run a little faster and a little more flamboyantly than the other members always do. You can just almost imagine him grumbling to himself that it's time for the slow song now. The guitar line generally breaks up the melody and creates a little more jarring flow than the previous songs, feeding more into that so-called dank smooth instead of original smooth. Generally, for most of its runtime, in the spirit of Welcome to Paradise, Christy Road does a great job of painting an emotion, a setting, and pulling you into the story of the song. And similar, but also even more so than the previous song, this really sets the stake as an album for punks, even though it's not necessarily punky in the traditional sense. Christy Road is simply a song for outcasts, a song about finding your way away from where everybody else is and forging a place that feels like home somewhere off the beaten path, and about retreating from normalness to that place when it's time to recharge again. It's a sentiment that definitely isn't distinct or exclusive to punks, but it helps remind that Green Day weren't writing for a mass audience with this album, that pretty much Kerplunk is an album to appeal to the daily lives of the punk scene, or more accurately, all the sweet children growing up into the new punk scene. And it wasn't all Molotov cocktails, because being a young punk also involves just a lot of teenage stuff and growing into yourself. And as the song goes on, it eventually gets to the sort of instrumental breakdown, and here the song tries to escalate, but admittedly the guitar work that had been very impressive and effective at being hazy, phased out, and very smooth to this point suddenly becomes a detriment. It just doesn't feel like Armstrong quite steps it up the way he needs to knock it out of the park and jump the album back to life for this sort of song that is not the A-side finale, but definitely feels like it carries that sort of energy. Mike and Trey just knock it out of the park, so it's a little distracting that Armstrong can't get it there, though this might just be a side effect of the otherwise good mastering, because as the song's played live, I think they generally do a much better job, but it might have been helped if not played a little more hard or intricately, if they just took a little more time to develop that portion of the song. Though the bit of awkwardness prior to this point aside, it's a perfect transition from the end of Christy Road to the next song, Private Ale. Private Ale has a grindy, kind of scratchy warm-up to it before exploding into a more smooth chorus, pretty effectively blending the two styles introduced so far. And it's the winding up and down between the danker verses and smoother choruses that makes the song feel like it really could have been an effective start to the B-side. And again, it feels like if the album was just a couple songs shorter or a couple songs longer, it would have flowed a little better. And Private Ale is the first example of something I call a bread and butter Green Day song. That's a standing title. I want to come up with a better one. And it's pretty much the idea that in this point in their career, Green Day weren't quite the perfectionists that they'd become, and were more content to sometimes release songs means that instead of pushing the envelope and being more inventive, we're just content to be another solid Green Day song with just one or two little interesting hooks to set it apart. Just compare Private Ale with how it's pretty much content to be very similar to a lot of the other songs on the album, just with a slightly different pace and its little funky breakdown towards the end to set it apart. Compare that to albums like Insomniac or Nimrod, where they have a lot of short songs in quick succession, but they still try a lot harder to make them distinct from each other. And it's something that, while not necessarily the most sustainable thing, was definitely valid for this point in their career, and is also kind of my favorite thing about this era of their sound. All in all, Private Ale does a very good job of rejuvenating the album, keeping it lively, and to kind of shake up the album flow again, it's, instead of rolling right into the next side, is followed up by Dominated Love Slave. Dominated Love Slave is absolutely a relic of how Green Day could be weird and let it loose in 1991. It's absolutely pretty much just kind of terrible, but I still really, I guess, admire it might not be the right word, but I'll use it, admire it for what it is. Maybe it's just because I live in the Midwest, but the way that Trey just sloppily combines a Midwest accent, a Southern accent, and a Western accent to this weird amalgamation is just kind of hilarious. And the way that he says pickup truck is just weirdly cathartic, hearing Trey just throw out this terrible accent that's weirdly spot on to the way that literally everybody in the Midwest says pickup truck. But the point is, the song is high art. It's the best song they've ever written. The next Bread and Butter Green Day song, One of My Lies, definitely has a vocal vibe a lot more similar to 39 Smooth than to what's on the rest of Kerplunk, and I kind of appreciate that. Just grounding the vibe they have now to the one they used to have and making it a little more cohesive across. And like a lot of 39 Smooth, it's not necessarily deep so much as it is pretty accurate and targeted, spot on, and relevant for the people that they're writing this for. And even though the bass line here is especially bubbly compared to some of the others, in general, the song is just probably, out of all the other songs on the album, the most just solid. So of course they follow up probably the most solid song on the album with my second favorite Green Day song of all time. Anyone who's seen my videos on Warning or Nimrod already know that I really appreciate the chemistry that the members of Green Day have between each other. And while I've gone into how this album has good rhythm section to melody section harmony, that doesn't necessarily mean that all three members are quite on that level between each other yet. At this point, they definitely have enough skill and chemistry to fit together and make good music, but they don't have quite that innate, just completely natural chemistry that they eventually will develop. And that's pretty true across the album in general, except here on 80, because 80, in my opinion, is the very first instance of Green Day displaying some of that perfect chemistry. Kicking off with a more traditional and humble, but also very creative and distinct bass line from Mike. That's absolutely my favorite bass line of his to date. Being joined by Trey playing in a fashion obviously more in his wheelhouse that he takes absolute charge of, breathing a peppy, fast life into the track and building the vibe as it grows, with the bass line chugging along, perfectly complementing it. To imperfect fashion for this album, Billy coming in with the focus on his vocals rather than the guitar for the melody at this point, before exploding into the chorus where the guitar, instead of being flamboyant and being like an incredible guitar line, just provides more volume and energy in a more vague and non-particular sense. Every part just plays off the other to create an effect larger than the sum of its parts. It's a song that, if you let yourself get swept up and just caught up in the vibe of it, ends up feeling a lot more sophisticated than its components actually are. And to me, 80 is a song that quite literally could only have been written by Green Day. You can't imagine any other pop-punk band, any other band of this era coming together with these distinct and exact parts to contribute. It's a song that's just saturated with the identity of the band, especially from this point in time. 80 feels like a Green Day song. 80 only feels like a Green Day song. And 80, in a way, is proof, is a very firm and confident statement that as a band, Green Day have something new to offer and something that is wholly theirs, an identity all to themselves. And of course, following 80 is a tough order, but it's followed by probably the weakest song on the album. There's nothing inherently wrong with Android as a song in and of itself. Alone in isolation, it's another solid bread and butter Green Day song, but following the groove that had been established pretty confidently since the end of Christie Road, it just throws the album's flow out of whack, out of the groove that it had gotten into again. Though lyrically, it is a nice maturation of the type of style that had been prevalent on 39 Smooth, taking a little bit of the type of style from No One Knows and taking it the next little level, a little deeper into introspection, and having a little more growth and change throughout the song, and just a little more creative lyrics. And this song's followed up by No One Knows, which is kind of just the definition of humble bragging from Mike. The bass line here just instantly nails a vibe and pulls you into the mood of the song without ever being super flashy. It's simple, but it's, again, very creative. While Christie Road was slower, No One Knows is arguably the first truly slow song from Green Day. And generally it plays sort of as a victory lap and maybe as the best showcase of how the sound on this album is surprisingly really good and effective at what it's doing. Again, kind of like Welcome to Paradise, instrumentals linger and hang down lower into the background of the track and into the lower pitch, with the vocals coming more into the foreground of the track. But here the instrumentals on top of the smooth haze that they generally have just a little bit more crunch. The vocals have just a little bit more definition, and it's just very effective at being what it is. No One Knows is followed up by Who Wrote
Holden
Caulfield.
And I think it's funny that in recent years, especially on the trilogy, Green Day's kept writing these songs about having fond memories of being teenagers and that kind of thing. Stuff like sex, drugs, and violence flashing back to school. But here in 1991, they did that type of song the best. And maybe that's because instead of playing a nostalgia angle, it more just straight up plays a straight experience. Who Wrote is just one of the most relatable Green Day songs, especially from their early catalog. Its story is something that everyone who would seek this album out would probably be able to relate to. The chemistry isn't quite as on point as on 80, but it's also pretty excellent here, especially getting to the more funky breakdown towards the end. In general, Who Wrote is just a very good song and is great at being pretty much the finale of the album. And I'm discussing this album in the way it was originally released, as just a short 10-song, about half-hour listen. And while usually it's now released bundled together with another EP from around that time, I think that extending the album and having other songs that go harder and have a more raw mastering just take away the effect and the finality, the closure that the song brings to the album. Because even though it's not super bombastic or super hard, the emotion of the song, it really takes center stage. It's just a great embodiment of, even though Kerplunk doesn't have incredible instrumentals overall, it really nails the emotions that it goes for. And even though it doesn't have a 2-minute ripping, amazing guitar solo, even though that little funky breakdown is so short, the things that the song is about and the way that it's just a solid song in general can bring that emotional closure and make the album satisfying anyway. It's actually just so emotionally cohesive as a closure to the album that it's something that I think Green Day even struggles with to this day. Really, anything from American Idiot onwards doesn't get as close to as solid an ending as this. Though you can definitely argue that, at least on American Idiot, that was on purpose. Of course, it isn't truly the end of the album. After this, there's a short little acoustic song, Words I Might Have Ate. And it's the very, very start, very foundation of Armstrong's appreciation for folk, and to some extent classic rock related to it. I don't have a lot to say about the song on its own, but it's kind of cute just thinking about how it started here and would eventually lead along the same sort of idea to the album Warning and to the experimentation that would follow from that. Kerplunk is a flawed album, and it's an album that's far from perfect. Things like harmony, flow, and album flow across it are often just a little off and don't nail the landing. But Kerplunk is also an album with an absurd amount of character. It's an album that's very individualistic. It has a very strong identity, and it definitely knows what it is, even if it doesn't always know how to be what it is. And maybe more than anything, Kerplunk is an album that could only have been written by Green Day and could only have been written once. It's the embodiment of what Green Day was in 1991. With Trey having recently joined, with their horizons soon to be expanding, with the perfectionism soon to be kicking in. It's an album that makes great improvements from their debut, but still has a lot of ground to cover before reaching what they would be when they write Dookie. Kerplunk is basically just an honest profile of the personality of the band Green Day in 1991. The emotions, the situation, and the energy that created it will never be able to be recreated. It's purely a product of its time and environment, and there will never be another album like it. It's a flawed album, but that doesn't mean it's not good, and that doesn't mean that it can't be valued. And even though it falls short to a lot of the criteria I use to judge music, because this is the way I've decided to do it, I still love Kerplunk. I love Kerplunk for everything that it is, and for everything that it isn't.
So anyways, last time we were here, we saw the most ridiculous Christmas play ever played. No, not yeah, it was bad. It was really bad.
I was Santa Claus.
I was a schizophrenic wise man, and I thought I was 3.
Trey was the Virgin Larry.
Larry. So anyways, try to let the band. We'll see you later. We have no drummer. We're quitting. Good night.